Welcome back to the Mom and Mind podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kat. On our episode today, I am joined by Dr. Helena Vissing. She is a licensed psychologist certified in perinatal mental health in private practice in California, and she practices trauma informed somatic psychotherapy as a somatic experiencing practitioner. She is experienced as adjunct faculty on the training committee of maternal mental health now, where she provides consultations and trainings of providers. Helena has written a book on her biopsychosocial model for the treatment of trauma in the perinatal period, published with Routledge, titled Somatic Maternal Healing, Psychodynamic and Somatic Trauma Treatment for Perinatal Mental Health. And we are going to get into that book and this treatment modality today. I think it's so important, the work that she's doing and the book that she has put out. There is the need for this type of therapeutic modality to be accessible to people, to be available to people, not only for treatment, but for providers to get training and understanding on how this type of healing modality can really, really support people who need it. She's going to talk to us a little bit about what psychodynamic means and what somatic means, and how the treatment of trauma and regulating of the nervous system can really, really impact people in the perinatal period. I'm excited to bring you this episode. So let's welcome Dr. Helena Vissing. Welcome, Dr. Vissing. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I know you have been working really, really hard on this book, and I think it is such a beautiful addition to the work in the perinatal world, and taking on what I think, from my perspective, anyways, a topic area and a subject that needs to be addressed more fully in a perinatal context. And so you're, I think, filling a really big gap in a resource for both providers and people who are looking for ways to heal. Um, so yeah, I'd love to hear. We're going to hear more about your book and the work that you're doing, and just thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Yes, is it okay if I just show a little
Of course,
here?
yes,
I'm
yes.
just sitting with it here. Yeah, it's been of course a long process. Writing a book is a big thing. But I do think that it's been a couple of years since this book idea came to me, but I also think that this book is coming as part of these changes we're seeing in our
Mhm,
field.
mhm,
I see it both within kind of the professional communities, which with where there's much more interest and desire to go into these topics, and I also see it among like mothers and parents and activists and
mhm,
peer support, the activism communities
mhm,
around perinatal mental health. Um, there's just this hunger for more and better and more holistic approaches to healing, where certainly the nervous system and the somatic approaches come in. So I see
right.
myself also as part of that collective
Mhm,
change
mhm.
happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the perinatal period is so I think in terms of mental health, unless you have a like a physical illness that you're dealing with, it's one of those times where the body and what's going on with the body is so it's up. It's part of what is happening. It's not just, quote unquote, the mental health, as if we're sort of cutting our heads off from the rest of our body. The whole body is involved because you're literally growing a person, or trying to, or birthing. And how could how could it not be a whole systems kind of perspective to take for healing?
Yeah, definitely. And the perinatal period, I think, is really at this time we're in, and obviously I'm talking from my cultural place in the world. Um, it's also a time we just really see the clash between biology and culture.
Mm.
Like we're
Mhm,
really
mhm.
confronted with ourselves as like animals and like the biology and then
Yeah,
culture.
right.
um and it's through that those bodily changes and nervous system changes, and so our kind of our mind, the psychology, and then our body, the way that they are so intertwined become so clear in the perinatal period. And within that, the bigger cultural changes. And I think we're having more of these conversations about that, as we say, the biopsychosocial or the
Mhm.
holistic conversations around it. But and that's been one of my big focus points for my book, is that I wanted to not just develop a um, somatic treatment model, or psychodynamic and somatic. I wanted to build a biopsychosocial framework
Mhm.
for implementing that. So, a framework where you're really looking at all the newest research and insights and theories from all the different paradigms. So, the biomedical fields,
Mhm.
the fields of sociology and psychosocial studies, and then also psychology, and how those different fields can really inform each other, challenge each other.
Mhm.
So that's also kind of the overall of my project. And then specifically for the techniques, if you will, or the clinical approach, it is a somatic and psychodynamic approach. And somatic here, I mean, there are lots of different somatic modalities, right? We also
Mhm.
call them
Yeah.
bottom up modalities.
Mm. Mhm.
Um, and I mean, basically, what that means is that it's modalities that are really targeting nervous system regulation. There are many ways of doing that. There are lots of great modalities. I'm trained in somatic experiencing, which is one approach. We're also seeing some of the other somatic approaches or bottom up approaches being developed for the perinatal population.
Mhm.
I happen to be training in this one that I'm very happy
Mhm.
to use, and I find it very useful for the perinatal population. Especially when it's integrated with other things like psychodynamic talk therapy. So that's all about these integrations, right? It's all about how, when we combine them, then they can really
Mhm.
stimulate each other, and we can really bring out the best in the somatic when we
Mhm.
also use psychoanalytic tools for understanding the psychology, and vice versa. So
Mhm.
it's a very integrative model in that way.
Can you talk a little bit about, I guess, some of the fundamentals of what is a somatic experiencing type of therapy? What happens in that type of therapy for folks? So
Yeah.
to help understand a little bit about what you're talking about in the book.
Yeah. So somatic therapy or somatic psychology, sometimes it's also, we also use the term body psychotherapy.
Hmm.
They're often used interchangeably. But the somatic modalities or body psychotherapies are about um, really actively looking at and addressing, targeting nervous system regulation and the bodily aspects of life, and what comes up in any therapeutic relationship. So um, what that means is also that it's often very experiential, and somatic
Hmm.
experiencing is certainly is. So experiential means that it is working about with what's happening in the moment.
Hmm.
So I think if you aren't familiar with it, like, imagine, like, also what you do in a, say you go into a dance class or a movement class, right? Or you going to a meditation class or things like that, where you're kind of actively being led in the moment through something.
Hmm.
And um, so in that way, the somatic experiencing is about that, is about supporting someone as they're going through their experiences in the moment.
Hmm.
And then there are like enormous amounts of different techniques and exercises and tools and things you can do for that. And it's all about supporting the person in their own self regulation in the
Hmm.
moment.
Hmm.
So you kind of practice that in the moment.
So
Um,
you're guiding them. You're not necessarily doing like physical movements for them.
Yeah, so it's about guiding. Although
Mhm.
you can also do guided movement. Movement is one example of exercises you can do. There's also, within somatic experiencing and other body psychotherapies, you can also use touch therapeutically. I'm at the moment, I'm not doing that. That's something that requires extensive extra training, but there are lots of body psychotherapists out there who
Hmm.
have also people who are mental health professionals gotten extra training to use that specifically.
Got it.
So that's like a kind of a sub-specialization
Hmm.
there where you can use touch. That's obviously something that body workers also
Hmm.
use. There's
Right.
lots. So this is what I also love about the somatic field is that it's very interdisciplinary.
Mm-hmm.
So we need that. I mean, us like mental health professionals, we need to be working with other professionals. The perinatal period is really where we need to have like that whole
Right.
interdisciplinary team,
Right. Right.
which is why it's so great when we get to go to do trainings and we get to meet with, the lactation consultants, the home
Hmm.
visitators, the
Hmm.
peer support group facilitators, the activists, the um, nurse practitioners. I
Hmm.
mean, these are just a little list of people. There are so many different professions because there
Hmm.
are so many people working with the family.
Yeah. Right. Right.
So
For
the
sure.
somatic is in a way can feel a bit like, oh, well, what is it? And it's a lot of things because it depends on who's using it and in what
For
context.
sure. Yep.
So of
Yep.
course I'm a a psychotherapist, so I am mostly experienced with the way that you adapt um, the body psychotherapy methods specifically for the talk therapy
Hmm.
situation. But it can be used in so many ways, and that's kind of the beauty of it is that then we can talk about these tools that we can all be using
Right. Right.
across
Making it
disciplines.
accessible. Yeah.
Yes.
For
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
And then, can you talk a little bit about what the psychodynamic therapy is, or what psychodynamic means?
Yes. So we call it the psychodynamic broadly. All the different schools that came originally from psychoanalysis. So when we say psychoanalysis, usually we think, well, that goes all the way back to Freud, and that was where it started. But so much has happened since Freud,
Hmm.
and there's been this long evolution. It's a huge field where
Right.
modern psychoanalysis today is completely different. What's actually interesting, this is going to get a little theoretical, geeky here, but it's one of my
Let's
most
do it. Yeah.
favorite topics. So the way that psychoanalysis evolved from like over the last, we're talking 100 years, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Feminism has actually been, as we know, as a big field, as philosophy, research, activism, political too. Feminism and psychoanalysis they have a very interesting relationship. There's a famous analyst, Juliet Mitchell, who said that they are two forms of thinking that need each other.
Mm. Hmm.
And when it comes to the question of the perinatal period, the maternal transition, parental transition, matrescence, as we call it today, this relationship between feminism and psychoanalysis is very, very interesting because feminism has really challenged psychoanalysis by pointing out like all the blind spots actually
Hmm. Hmm.
and the flaws and the
Some of
the
the
limitation.
patriarchal
Yeah,
ways.
yeah,
Hmm.
because the original classic psychoanalysis was of its time. It was actually useful for understanding the
Hmm.
patriarchal structures, right?
Hmm.
But in those ongoing feminist critiques of psychoanalysis, we actually were able to really expand and evolve. And then we also, since then, had all of our research around infant development and attachment and
Hmm.
neuroscience and all of that, which we've seen this like massive growth of over the last like 50 years.
Hmm.
We have really been able to, there's been this evolution in psychoanalysis. We call it also the relational turn.
Hmm.
Um, and that is so valuable for when we're talking about understanding the psychology of mothering, also all parenting and
Hmm.
certainly mothering. I mean, all the big philosophical questions of gender and the body and how do we understand family? How do you come into being as a
Hmm.
person?
Hmm.
It's right there in the relationship between psychoanalysis and feminism. So I found that so helpful for my work. So the psychodynamic here I'm drawing on is these schools of like the feminist engagements with psychoanalysis that developed to really say, hey, what about the mother's perspective?
Hmm.
because that is crucial to understanding what's going on for the child. But it's also important just in and of itself, not just for the sake of the child to look at. And from for our perspective in perinatal mental health,
Hmm.
it's like, of course, because that's where we're coming from about the importance of the mother's and the parents' perspective.
Right, right. Great. So thank you for that. So the in the book and in your work, you're joining together and intersecting the somatic work with the psychodynamic work and pulling together the whole system, understanding what's happening in the moment physically in somatic therapies, and then also I guess kind of what's behind the scenes, what's pulling on people and impacting people in their process. Okay, so in your book, you're also talking about trauma, and in the perinatal period, there's a lot of different ways people can experience trauma. Can you talk a little bit about trauma in the perinatal period, in particular, and some of the stuff you address in the book?
Yeah. Yeah, the question of trauma is important, and it's also really tricky because it's a lot of things, right?
Mhm,
This term trauma is really so limiting because we're talking about so many things when we're talking about trauma,
mhm,
and specifically for the perinatal period, there's a lot going on there. So, um, the trauma is important because, as we talked about the biopsychosocial model, we need to look at trauma from all those perspectives.
mm,
And what we know about the perinatal period is that it's this unique time for growth and transformation, and it's also a time of vulnerability.
right.
There's it's very vulnerable, and it's particularly vulnerable to trauma.
Yeah.
And we know that from all the biomedical research that the way that trauma and traumatic stress impacts our bodies, um, in very delicate ways, that poses that there's this vulnerability of the perinatal transition that
Mhm,
that is connected to that. And we also know that the stressors, so, on a social level, we're also more at risk for traumatic stress, and
mhm,
psychologically too, for the individual. So when I was working on like trying to get a sense of like define how do we define trauma? Well, first of all, the trauma research has, this is a known challenge. It's been so dominated by the research on PTSD.
mhm,
And while the research on PTSD is really important, and there's been a lot of great research done, the problem is that PTSD is just one particular form of trauma. It's one particular presentation,
right.
and trauma presents in many different ways. And especially in the perinatal period, trauma will present in a lot of very complicated, subtle ways.
Right.
So it is something we're dealing with, like that. The whole literature and our and the way that the research has been developed has been very kind of formed by the whole perspective of PTSD.
Mhm,
It's only recently in history we're starting to challenge that. So
mhm,
so I we have to kind of m- make our understanding of trauma more flexible and
right.
widen it. But I was thinking I could actually just read. I came with a definition of perinatal trauma. Now, you know, trauma is wide, and there could be lots of different definitions of that too. And I work a
Yes.
lot with the somatic definition, of course.
Yep.
But I wanted to just talk about how I see perinatal trauma because
Yeah.
I see it as the trauma reactions in response to the stressors that occur during the perinatal transition, of
Mhm,
course.
yeah.
And these factors, they interact with the individual parent's biopsychosocial history, the
Mhm,
physiological adaptations of reproduction,
mhm,
the medical interventions, iatrogenic effects, that's the effects coming from getting treatment, kind of
mhm,
side effects, if you will, and the subjective experiences of becoming a parent, and the systemic and cultural contexts that the parent is embedded in.
yeah.
And these interacting factors can each be an individual source of trauma,
Right.
and they can exacerbate each other's impact, which is what
Mhm.
we often see.
Right. Right. It's not just
So,
one singular thing that happens in a vacuum that's not either impacted or affected by other things that are also happening.
yeah. So that means that we really have to broaden our concept of trauma here.
Mhm.
The kind of classic PTSD model is not adequate. It's just too limited if we're going to understand perinatal trauma fully. Um, the way that trauma manifests, we also know it can manifest in a lot of very different ways compared to other times in life
Mhm.
in the perinatal period
Mhm.
because of obviously what's going on. You are maybe going through, pregnancy. Maybe you're going through fertility treatment, pregnancy, delivery, or also in the case of adoption, in the postpartum, you have a baby. Like the way you react to a trauma is going to be completely different when you're in those circumstances.
Right.
Also, now we're starting to understand trauma broadly from a developmental perspective. A lot of people know the term complex PTSD, right, or developmental trauma. So we also know that's huge in the perinatal transition
Mhm.
because your whole developmental history is is going to be activated in different ways in the perinatal transition.
Yeah, people are not expecting that, not at all. But
Mm-hmm.
it is so frequent, so common.
Mm-hmm.
And I think like just being um, sort of confronted or that being brought up can be its own now new factor that you have to deal with, the surprise of dealing with stuff you forgot about or set aside or pushed down or whatever from your own history. Now you have to deal with that too. That is so overwhelming for
It
people.
is very overwhelming. And some people, like, they just don't expect it at all. Of course not. They've been so they're I mean, people are living in the here and now. They're not
Hmm.
thinking about, the past, right? They're living in the here and now. They're having a
Yep.
baby. They're on
Right.
that, right? And then it can come up. But I think even those people who are, have some awareness and think,
Mm.
oh yeah, maybe now having a baby can maybe bring up stuff. But the thing is, I think no matter how much you think of that, I don't think you can ever be prepared because you don't know. I mean, it's you can't prepare for something like that. You don't
Hmm.
know how it's going to impact you.
No.
It is really venturing into this unknown,
Hmm.
having a baby, and it's like going out into this like big landscape, and you have no roadmap,
Right.
and you don't know anything what's gonna happen. But
Hmm.
again, this is also where the trauma is unique here because the trauma, for example, of having, it could be childhood stuff coming up, attachment trauma, or traumatic events in childhood come up when you have a baby. The thing is that that's hard, and it's a vulnerability, right? And it's a strain. At the same time, we're also seeing that transition into motherhood can be an opportunity to heal through that trauma in
Yep.
ways that was just not accessible before
Right.
you had a baby.
Yeah. Yeah. And I for sure also hear, people say things like, well, I had therapy. I kind of thought I dealt with that. I thought I was done. And then the new context brings up maybe a new perspective or a new part of stuff you've already dealt with that comes up for the opportunity for healing.
Mm. Yeah, and I love the both the somatic approach and also the psychodynamic approach. There's a lot of like the strength based thinking in it, of looking at yes, it's going to be very hard, this strain on your mind and your body and your nervous system and everything, but it is also, this is like, I kind of tongue in cheek call it the upgrade, the nervous system
Mhm.
upgrade,
Nice.
because it's such an overwhelm, but it's also a way like your nervous system is gonna stretch,
Mhm.
your
Mhm.
psyche is gonna stretch open, and in that there's this opportunity for reworking, and a lot of people will can resonate with. Yeah, of course, the reworking of relationships and your role and identity. And then the somatic comes in and say, yeah, you're reworking all of that. What is that concretely? That's
Mhm.
also reworking your relationship to your body, your
Mhm.
whole
Mhm.
the way your personality of your self-regulation is. How do you move in your body?
Right.
How do you regulate yourself? How do you
Yeah.
experience sensations
Mhm.
in your body? All that is also going to be completely um, reworked. That where the somatic body psychotherapy tools are really helpful for that, because it's all about going in and supporting that, because it can feel like a complete relearning, right? Like,
Oh yeah.
and it can feel like you're sometimes starting from scratch,
Right.
even though I think it's important we always think about, like, no, you're not starting from scratch. It
Mhm.
can feel like that,
Mhm.
but you're not, because a really important part of the philosophy of the somatic approach, the somatic experiencing, is that we say that you have all the capacities you need to heal
Mhm.
from trauma and
Mhm.
overwhelm,
Mhm.
right? You have what it takes. Like, you have it in your body. It's a matter of you being supported through
Right.
safety in a safe relational connection, where you are helped to be, you're
Mhm.
guided to practice your sensory awareness, so that the overwhelm from, for example, traumatic experiences, um, can be worked through and renegotiated.
Right.
So whether that's like a chronic tendency to be very anxious because your whole nervous system is hypersensitive in that way
Right.
due
Right.
to developmental factors and
Mhm.
also, some inborn factors,
Mhm.
or if it's like there was particular traumatic events like a difficult delivery or the fertility treatment or what have you, that was like
Mhm.
very shock
Right.
events
Right. Right. Yep.
that will, have shock events that have created a lot of charge. Then you can work through that to, discharge some of that and help to build up um, your ways of coping with that, so that some of that, so you can release that charge and come down in your nervous system.
So, I mean, these are some of the ways it's really important to focus on the nervous system in the perinatal period. And like for somebody who's, I guess, just hearing about this for the first time, w- what would you say? I'm trying to think of like how to help. I'm thinking of the mom out there who's listening, who's like, this sounds great, and I want that. And what would happen in like or even in the book, like what are you um sharing with people that helps the nervous system um I guess regulate.
Yeah. Um, so yeah, there's a some important principles to consider first. And so, first of all, in that context of the new mom and the perinatal period, is that w- we're so busy, right, with the baby and taking care of someone else's needs. So we are so attuned to the baby's need, right? We're so feeling into it all the time, right? Of course. And so for a lot of people, just that shift in perspective of saying, well, we should also really be looking at what you are feeling in your body in the day to
Mhm.
day.
Mhm.
For some, it can feel like almost like wrong. Like, am I supposed to be paying attention to that? Like,
Right.
like there's this natural way we forget our bodies, we forget ourselves because
Mhm.
it's all about the baby. And that's
Mhm.
that, the survival instinct, right? That's the survival
Sure.
impulse that is
Mhm.
so strong, right? It's
Mhm.
all about the
Mhm.
baby. So even just starting to practice that for some can actually be a big shift, where we're starting to say, well, how you are feeling in your body, your sensations are important, and to practice tuning into that. And I also see a lot of that being talked
Mhm.
about mothers' needs. I mean, we've been talking about this for years, right?
Yeah.
Mothers' needs matter.
Mhm.
Um, but when we talk about our needs, what I like about the somatic approach is that it really concretizes things. So instead of talking about it in a more abstract way, like, oh, I have needs for like feeling fulfilled or have my social
Mhm.
relationships or not be so bored or, feel balance or, it can be a little abstract. And then these ideas of like, oh, it would be nice if I could, get a massage or something. And those things are of course nice,
Yeah.
but all the nice things you can do, I mean, all of it for it to really really make a big radical difference, there needs to be this basis of, in your day to day,
Mhm.
what you are experiencing, your we call it sensory awareness.
Mhm.
That is the cornerstone. That's what we start with. So that's what I work with people, and that's what we talk about. The sensory awareness, which is your awareness of sensations, but it's also more than that. It is your awareness of sensations and the way you're making use of your sensations
Mhm.
as information
Mhm.
to do the things you need to do
Mhm.
to regulate yourself,
Mhm.
and to also not just on your own, because regulation is not just happening in isolation, but to then know how to then be in your relationships where you get support through we call it co-regulation.
Right.
Right, it's an important part here, so that it's not all on the mom or the parent to just regulate
Yes.
themselves, right?
Right. Yeah.
Because regulation is something that is happening in relationships. um, so it's very concrete, like, how do you go about your day? How are you tracking your sensations? How are
Mhm.
you able to um, impact how you're experiencing sensations, like to up
Right.
and down,
Right.
turn up and down the volume. I like this analogy. It's a little cheesy, but I love it. The
Mm.
analogy of surfing is that, the waves are just going to come at you and you cannot control the waves, right? Just like
Mhm.
the nervous system sensations, things are
Mhm.
just happening.
Mhm.
It's like the weather, you can't control it. Things are happening outside of you that you don't have control over. But what you can learn is that you can learn to surf the waves,
Right.
right? You
Right.
can learn to, when there's a big wave coming of like overwhelm or anger, frustration, or something, you can learn to kind of ride that wave, get up on it, and ride it and come down with it
Mhm.
again.
Mhm.
And I like the analogy because although I don't surf myself, I know
Mhm.
that surfing is really hard.
Mhm.
It's a really hard skill. And this is really hard,
Right.
especially in the perinatal period. It is
Right.
really, really hard, but it is possible.
Yes. Right.
So it's all about practicing that. And so that's the goal, right? Is that we
Right.
get
Right.
to a place where we can really ride those waves and have that capacity to contain all the new sensations, and emotions and the way they manifest in our bodies.
That's fantastic. I really do love that analogy as well. Because right, I mean, those waves are powerful. Mother Nature is no joke. And being able to know that you yourself can have a different relationship to that overwhelm and overstimulation is a really powerful tool. Really, really powerful. Because it helps people feel like they're not just being thrown around
Mm,
by everything.
yeah.
I'm gonna.
and and then
Uh,
yeah, so that's kind of where we start with, right? With the sensory awareness and uh, building our relationship to sensation and our embodiment. But I wanted to right away say, well, we don't just stop there, because
mhm,
there's more. And because when we have really worked on that, and by the way, slowing down is a big part of that, because when we slow down,
mhm,
that's a big part of being able to track your sensations. And I know slowing down is really hard in the perinatal period.
mhm.
It's really hard. It's like it feels impossible. And yet it can make a difference when we practice it as much as we can. But the the when we practice all of these regulation skills for this context of the perinatal period, it's not just about saying, oh well, if you can get really regulated, that's great and you'll be fine. This is because this is a time where you are going through a massive transformation of your identity, your
Mm-hmm.
life, your
Mm-hmm.
relationships, your roles. And that means that, the who you are is also how you move around in the world in your body.
Mm-hmm.
And if you are a new mother or coming into motherhood, that means that being a mother is embedded in how you move around in the world. So, and this is where I draw on a concept developed by Christine Caldwell. She talks about body fullness. So think of mindfulness, but the somatic version of it, the somatic
Mm-hmm.
cousin to it,
Mm-hmm.
where it's not just about mindfulness on like a mind level. It's about on a very concrete physical somatic level and being very reflective about what's happening in your body, like I talked about with sensory awareness.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was studying this concept, I was like, well, this is like has to be applied like specifically for what it means to be a mom. So
Mm-hmm.
maternal bodyfulness. So maternal bodyfulness is a term I like because or I like to use it to capture this process of coming into your new self as a mother in a very embodied way. And what
Mm-hmm.
that means is also that you're not seeing your mothering as this like chore or performance or something you're doing because there's this like objective truth about the correct way of mothering,
Uh-huh.
right? We
Right.
we know mothering is not like that. It is
Mm-hmm.
deeply individual and personal, and in that specific context of you and your relationships and your cultural context and the conditions you're mothering under. And mothering in that way becomes a embodied expression of who you are,
Mm-hmm.
right? We all mother in different ways, and I want to really emphasize that that's not just an abstract thing we do. It's a very embodied, physical, felt,
Mm-hmm.
sensory thing.
Mm-hmm.
So when we can experience all that journey of like, oh, and how am I doing? And what works for me? What kind of feeding works for me? What kind of holding? How much holding compared to also my child? And what are they like? And really navigating all of that. And we know that's like a big journey.
Yeah.
That is a process of really expressing yourself
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
in your new reality as a
Mm-hmm.
a maternal embodied person. By the way, I also want to mention that I am very focused on maternal bodyfulness. I I really see that this is like a way of thinking that can be taken in many directions. Paternal bodyfulness, parental bodyfulness, like any thinkable, more you could even go more specific, like maternal bodyfulness specific to other identities
Mm-hmm.
or circumstances you're mothering under.
Mm-hmm.
And I would invite anyone to take it in those directions and play with it and work with it. Um, but it's just like that. So it's just important to bring that piece into it
Yeah.
because that's what's so unique about the somatic aspects of the perinatal transition.
I'm curious, for oftentimes for people who have had um, trauma during the perinatal period that is maybe more focused on a physical trauma, not that it's not impacting a um, mental focused, I guess, for lack of a better way to say it. There's can be a lot of avoidance. People, I think, very naturally want to protect themselves and avoid being in touch with anything that feels like too close physically, even to the trauma that they experienced. So how can, I guess, for somebody who's feeling like, oh gosh, I need that kind of help, but it's also a little scary to think about, um, you know, being in touch with that. How does trauma healing happen, or what can that look like?
Yeah, and I'm happy you bring that up because it's very common and it's also very understandable,
Mm-hmm.
which is the first part there is that we need to really talk about it and acknowledge it fully how it's understandable that there's this avoidance if
Mm-hmm.
the body or the bodily does not feel safe, well, there's a reason for it, right? Because there was
Mhm.
too much overwhelm, and we want to avoid that as a way of surviving and coping.
Right.
And I think there's a wisdom to that kind of coping, because when you're needing to deal with everyday life of parenting, you just have it's like you have to find a way to compartmentalize and function.
Right.
And then we have to offer this hope, right? There is
Hmm.
a hope for that. So even if it feels impossible, even if it feels like, oh, I'm never going to be one of those people who's going to be like doing somatic meditation and feel in touch with my body. Never. That's like, oh, I don't
Right.
even want to go there. Like, we need to offer hope. Like, it is possible. It can feel impossible, but it is possible. I know I see it all the time in my work, which is amazing. People who have, felt like they could never practice getting in touch with their sensations in their body go through amazing healing
Hmm.
processes. It is possible. It is you need safety, right? That's the number
Yeah.
one thing. You need to work with someone where you feel that relational safety,
Hmm.
because you're not going to start to progress if you don't have that. So that's the number one thing, is that there is safety,
Yeah.
relational safety. Also, you can't do it on your own. You're
Hmm.
not, that's not possible to just sit on your own and on your own do some somatic meditation and then you'll get a good relationship to your body, right? No, there needs to be a very strong relationship where you feel safe and
Hmm.
can be guided in that,
Hmm.
right? That's why there's all these, body psychotherapies
Right.
modalities, because
Right.
the therapeutic relationship is huge there.
Hmm.
um, and the key is also there to really go slow. So it's not about h- setting these unrealistic expectations of going from someone who's like usually not really in touch with their body because it's just too hard. They don't want it. It's too feels unsafe, to then suddenly going all the way to being someone who's super in touch with their
Hmm.
bodies. That's unrealistic. The idea is that some of that charge of like, oh, my sensations, I don't want to go there, is that is lessened. So
Hmm.
we often want to work much more on just neutrality. What does
Yeah.
it mean to come to a place of feeling a bit more neutral in sensations, and how your associations with your sensations?
Hmm.
A lot of that kind of avoidance or fear about sensations is about these where you associate any sensation in a negative, right? And
Hmm.
that's because the way that like the body mind connection is, there's such an overly focus on interpreting sensations in a
Hmm.
negative light. Like
Hmm.
sensations,
Hmm.
bad. Pretty much all sensations always about negative emotions. That's about negative relational interactions. Don't even want to go there. Nothing good about it. That needs to be completely relearned,
Hmm. Hmm.
where we need to learn to trust sensations.
Hmm.
And that starts with really baby steps
Right.
of trusting sensations in the tiniest, like really, really, really. I work on like the tiniest level of like, can you trust that there's too much light coming in the window? So I'm closing my eyes and
Hmm.
I'm trusting this feeling of like, I can do that. I did that. And then,
Hmm.
that was
Hmm.
nice. I
Hmm.
shielded myself from the light. Or like, it's cold. I put on a shirt. Like, it seems so simple and like almost silly, but this is what we're starting from,
Right.
because that's the building blocks.
Yeah, I mean, it's not silly. I think there are so many ways in which people aren't even aware how they force themselves to overlook things like that. Or like, whatever, it's bright, I'm just gonna tough it out, or it's cold and I can get through it. Because maybe they had to learn how to override that or look past it or diminish their experience in some way to cope in the past. But um I mean, the piece of safety that you're describing is so important because maybe for whatever reason they learned that they couldn't just put on a jacket or take care of themselves in that way. And although it might seem small, like you're saying, as an example, the ramifications for just that way of learning how to cope could be impacting so many other ways that you uh, diminish your own experience.
Mhm.
I do think it's uh, eh, you're getting to some of the maybe nuanced or more root experiences by attending to some of these things that feel or seem benign.
Mm. Yeah, well, it's all about we have to dig deep, right?
Hmm.
This work. It's about digging deep. And I think, you know, there's also something about um all those things about learning if you know in your developmental your upbringing what was available, what was the kind of support you got or didn't get. um the that is the foundation of how we feel at home in our bodies and
Hmm.
how we can feel a secure relationship, a secure attachment to our bodies.
Hmm.
So if we didn't have that, and if we have some wounds in that from our childhood for all in all the different constellations it comes, it's so hard to be a mom and a parent because then
Hmm.
you're having to provide that for your child.
Right.
um I talk in the book about, we can have, a traumatized body self if you have severe trauma, right? Or gone through trauma, or a wounded body self. And it is so hard to mother from a wounded body self. It can feel like the hardest thing you've ever done.
Hmm.
And I just really want to emphasize and repeat again and again this message of hope, that it is possible to heal that. It's not easy
Yeah.
at all.
Yeah.
Not at all. It's a lot of work, and it's a lot of work in all the aspects of your life, not just like therapy sessions. It's about
Right. Right.
all the ways, you're getting your social support, the way you're setting up your life, your work life balance, how whatever your options are for that, your spiritual well-being, all of these things,
Hmm.
um your physical health and all that, the way all of these combined, um are that's your healing process. And especially those really safe relationships, therapeutic relationships,
Right.
where you can restore and heal through that sense of self in your body.
Right.
And it is possible
Right.
to then come into a healed sense of self, your maternal bodyfulness.
Hmm.
And sometimes it's going to take a while, because also remember, this is happening in this context where that perinatal journey, wherever you are in it, it's happening, it's not
Hmm.
stopping,
Right.
you know
Right.
and it's happening wherever you are in, like, fertility, pregnancies, children coming, postpartum, and then suddenly, oh, the kid is the one, and then my second is one, and then the firstborn is 3 and 4, and
Hmm.
that's the timeline. And just the one thing I also want to mention about the unique thing about trauma and the perinatal is that your trauma healing process and your journey of coming into your to motherhood are gonna just be so intertwined,
Hmm.
right? I
Hmm.
don't think that they can be separated, which is
Hmm.
heavy, but
Right.
there's also a beauty in that.
No, absolutely. It's a massive time of growth that can really just enrich your life in ways it couldn't have expected, especially if you get healing along the way. So I love this conversation, and we could talk about this for a long time. There's so much in here, and I know you put a lot of it into a book so that people can learn and know about this modality. And let people know where they can find more about you and the book.
Yeah, I have my website, my name, helenavising.com, where I you can read about my work. I'm also on Instagram, also my name, Helena Vising, where I post about my work. So yeah, those are the main ways to get in touch with me.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for writing this book and sharing this with us. Obviously, you know so much about this, and you put a lot of time and effort and energy and heart into the book. And I really hope people go get it and learn more and check it out. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.